whenever you start building yourself a new deck and you start looking at all the monster typings, certain decks always come to mind. Start playing some dragons, you're going to start thinking about things like Blue Eyes, Dragon Link, Red Eyes, things of that nature. Start thinking about rocks, perhaps, Adamanticators and Gem Knights. Psychics, no, all the way. Eventually, however, you're going to be stumbling down to the Reptile grouping, and, well, things are going to get a little sparser down there. Of course, you got things like aliens who have got some decent controlling potential, and you got Ogdoadics who just love to chill out in the graveyard. But then, of course, you have Venoms, the very much attention-starved Venoms. Debuting in Yu-Gi-Oh! GX's Darker Season 3 Act 1, piloted by Viper, everybody's favorite substitute teacher, whose playstyle focused on wearing the opponent down by dragging them through the swamp. This dude's son got isekai'd right in front of him, and his first thought was a devil's bargain. What a guy. And before we begin, I do want to mention that I have, of course, seen Rank 10 Yu-Gi-Oh's Legacy of the Worthless video on Venoms, but seeing as that video is about, 8 years old, Venoms still haven't been supported in that time frame, I think it's about time we take a fresh look at Venoms, because the game has changed significantly in that span of time. Now, in order to talk about Venoms, we first have to talk about their field spell, Venom Swamp, which allows that during each player's end phase, you place a Venom counter on a numbered face-up monster, except for Venom monsters. Any monster loses 500 attack for every Venom counter on them, and if Venom counters get placed on monsters and its attack becomes 0, then all monsters that its attack gets reduced to 0 by this effect get destroyed. A Venom Swamp keeps the theme of the Venoms alive. It's all about wearing the opponent down bit by bit, drag them through the swamp, and drown them. That's the whole idea of Venoms. Now, in a modern sense, this card might seem absolutely garbage, but you gotta remember, 2007 was a completely different card game. You could conceivably have a monster on the board for more than 1/10 of a second. Can you imagine that being the case? Hard to see it nowadays, but back in that day, it wasn't all too common to go off like 10 different monsters in a turn. Heck, it was hard to get 5 different monsters in one turn. So the idea of having a bunch of monsters on the field for Venom Swamp to start weakening, not unheard of, especially considering this was right before we had like Gladiator Beasts format and all that good stuff. And, you know, things like Gravity Bind and Level 11 Area B were still very much a thing. So it was conceivable that Venom Swamp could prove a hassle to the opponent. You know, any monster that got left on the field too long, then it was going to start losing its attack points. And it incentivizes your opponent to really think, do they want to put all the effort into making a big boss monster? And if they do, are you going to keep that monster too long so it gets destroyed, or your opponent going to have to tribute the darn thing off? It's a tricky card. Definitely something that early Yu-Gi-Oh! Players had to at least consider, unless it got destroyed, in which case Venom players got very upset.
You mortals destroyed my swamp. Then I will take your heads as reparation.
Getting into the monsters, we take a quick look at Venom Cobra, which is a level 4 Earth Reptile with 100 attack and 2000 defense, whose flavored text simply states that it hunts by shooting out massive amounts of venom, but because of its large size, its attack pattern is easily predicted.
And I fired, and I missed. This went on for several hours, and then I fired, and then I missed.
Anything I can say about normal monsters and just generic sort of support really fits with Cobra. You use things like Primate Roar, Unexpected Die to turbo the thing out. There's certain rank 4s you can go into that'll allow Venom Cobra to put in some work for you. You could always fuse 2 together to make First of the Dragons if you want a spicy tech card. It's one of those cards that you just throw into the deck if you want to spice up your gameplay. It's not going to make or break your Venom deck so much as it just adds a little bit of flavor. Getting to the more meaningful monsters, we have the first two, that being the level 3 Earth Reptile Venom Snake with 1200 attack and 600 defense, and the level 4 Dark Reptile Venom Serpent with 1000 attack and 800 defense. Why are we talking about these at the same time? Well, it's because they have almost the exact same effect of placing a Venom counter on a monster the opponent controls, with Venom Snake only have the additional clause that it can't attack during the turn that it uses this effect. Both of these monsters belong to an elite club of early day Yu-Gi-Oh! Monsters with soft once per turn effects. Well, they're not quite the same as like Infinity Archfiend, but the fact is you could loot these if you put enough effort into it. Now, these guys do keep with the whole theme of dragging the opponent down bit by bit. It's still a little slow, just a little bit slow. Plus, the attack on these monsters isn't all that high, although a copy of Solidarity will fix that right up. The real boon that you're going to have from these monsters being around on the board is that there are plenty of monsters that can be special summoned to your field, They'll allow you to make use of their levels going into Synchro and Xyz plays to give yourself a lot of different tech options. Venom Serpent, being a level 4, can be combined easily with things like Kageto Kage and Reptilian Poodle in order to sum out things such as King of the Feral Imps, Reptilian, Melusine, the works. And being a level 3, Venom Snake can be combined with things like Kagamucha Knight in order to make some nice rank 3 plays such as Phantom Knight's Break Sword, Bamboozling Opship Shadow, whatever you'd like to have. So there's a lot of different variations of Venoms that you can actually make thanks to more modern support. Granted, we would still like Venoms themselves to get support for themselves, but it is nice that despite these monsters being so old, there are some nice spicy tech cards that you can throw in with your Venoms. The only real thing I would say bad about these two monsters, other than the fact that their effects are completely, slow as all heck, is the fact that they have different attributes. It would have been really nice if all the Venoms had been Earth, or all of them had been Dark so you could use Allure, Earth so you could use all the different Earth tech cards. As for the ratios of these cards in your deck, I would say that you're going to run Venom Serpent a whole heck of a lot more. He's just a bit more useful than Venom Snake, but it really depends on the build you're going for. 3 Serpents, 2 Snakes in a more straightforward Venom deck, but again, it all depends on what you want to do with them. Next up, we have Venom Boa, which is the level 5 Earth Reptile with 1600 attack and 1200 defense, and get ready for this. He puts 2 Venom counters on a monster the opponent controls, but he can't attack during this turn. Venom Boa really just kind of feels like a fusion of Venom Serpent and Snake. His effect is literally just like stacking their effects on top of each other. So it doesn't feel like Venom Boa is really like good on a first look, but then you start really thinking about it. This is your tribute summon monster and your Venom single tribute monster. And you know what that means? It's time to start stealing your opponent's stuff. Running things like Change of Heart, Snatch Steal, Crackdown, tributing off your opponent's stuff in order to make advantage for yourself with the Venom Boa really harkens back to the whole control origins of the Venoms. And you just tribute this guy off, start weakening your opponent's monsters again, do whatever have you may. Or if you want, you could run yourself a couple of maybe some spicy cards here and there to turn Venoms into like a Monarch deck, more or less. I mean, you might as well just pretend like you're playing Monarch with your Venoms. I mean, that's kind of like how Monarch players like to pretend like they're playing Monarchs. As to how many Venom Boas you're going to run, it really depends on the build you're going for. If you're playing pure Venoms, you play 1 or 2 copies of this. If you're playing like Synchro Xyz, maybe don't run this guy at all. It really just depends. And if you're playing the Monarch version of Venoms, then you play through the darn thing, because why the heck not? Next up on the monster shopping block is what one would assume is the first boss monster, that being Phenomenon, the king of the poisonous snakes. Ooh, he's so scary. Don't run into this guy in a dark alleyway. He's a level 8 Dark Reptile with 0 attack and defense, who cannot be special summoned by another monster's effect. He's unaffected by Venom Swamp. You have to remember, he is not actually a Venom monster, he's Phenomenon. He gains 500 attack for every reptile in your grave, and when destroy a battle and send to the grave, you can banish a reptile from the grave and summon Phenomenon to the field. I'm not sure what it is about early Yu-Gi-Oh! And Kings and your attack is based on all your dead subjects that Konami seem to have been going for with a few things, but yeah, that's what Phenomenon is. You basically just gotta fill up your graveyard with snakes and things, with a card that we'll talk about in a little bit. Just prepare your butts for when that comes by. But Phenomenon is perfectly acceptable. It's just a big old honking beat stick. It's pretty dang straightforward. A very refreshing card compared to modern day boss monsters. Phenomenon also reasonably versatile. You can summon this thing out with pretty much whatever you need, as long as it's not a monster. Damage equals Reptile can summon it straight from the deck. There's plenty of ways to summon it back from the graveyard, things like Called by the Grave, Monster Born, what have you. And, he can bring himself back if need be. However, with the fact that he's going to be, reviving himself from battle, your opponent's more often than not going to just pop him with a card effect. That's just kind of how it goes. But that's where Venoms get a little weird, because, funnily enough, that's what you want to happen to Phenomenon. As to why that is, well, first we're going to take a look at a trap card of theirs. Offerings to the Snake Deity. It's a normal trap that targets a face-up reptile you control and 2 cards of the opponent's, and destroys all 3. Icarus attack, meet your coven. That's right. This is just your basic sort of removal card. You're going to have to pop one of your reptiles. It can be any reptile you'd like. And it pops 2 of your opponent's cards. Simple, straightforward. But as per the artwork showing the smoldering corpse of Phenomenon, this is all leading somewhere. And where does it lead, you ask? Well, of course it leads to Venominaga, the deity of poisonous snakes. This is our level 10 Dark Reptile with 0 attack and defense. Cannot be normal summoned or set. Must be special summoned with Rise of the Snake Deity, which is a trap that summons out Venominaga when Venominon gets destroyed. And it cannot be special summoned by other ways except by its own effect. It gains 500 attack for every reptile in the grave. Neither player can target this card with card effects, and it is unaffected by other cards and their effects. When this card is destroyed by battle instead of the graveyard, you can banish another reptile from the grave and special summon this card. And if this card inflicts battle damage to the opponent, you place a Hyper Venom counter on it. And when the third Hyper Venom counter is placed on Venominaga, you win the duel. Now that is what you call an extreme tonal whiplash, if ever there was one. We went from a slow control-centric deck trying to whittle down the opponent's monsters to the earliest example of total defensive boss monster in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. Big, massive attack values, incorruptible by opponent's card effects and things. She's immune to your opponent's floodgates and things. So she's just going to be able to start ramming over your opponent's monsters, dealing that damage, building up the hyper counters for that automatic win. Now, there's a couple little issues with Venominaga. Little things, I will say, little things. First off, you're going to be trying to turbo out Venominaga as quickly as humanly possible for the most part. You know, the game is just kind of in that state, and also just, you know, you got to pop Venominaga before your opponent just banishes the darn thing. That's kind of important. And that is going to make things a little tricky for Venominaga. More often than not, she's going to start relatively small. You know, somewhere in the 1,500 to 2,000 range, something like that. So, Venominaga might start off a little bit smaller than you'd like her to be, but given time, she'll be big enough to take on anything. The other bit of an issue with Venominaga, you know, other than the fact that she needs to be special summoned with a very specific trap with a when clause on it, so you miss his timing half of the time, is that Venominaga's secondary effect is a little weird. Now, don't get me wrong, having a monster of this caliber having an auto-win effect is absolutely crazy, but you have to understand the context of things. If Venominaga has a decent amount of attack, let's say she has 3,000 attack, and she's doing battle damage to the opponent, assuming your opponent has no monsters, your opponent's going to run out of life points before Venominaga's effect goes off. Unless you're bullying a Romage player, which is totally acceptable. And let's not forget, if your opponent sees that you have 2 Hyper Venom counters on this thing, they're just going to scoop. Which I guess means that the auto-win technically worked, but it didn't work because it didn't go off, but it still won you the duel. Something like that. Anyway, it's very tricky to get Venominaga's secondary effect off to actually auto-win you with that. There are ways of making it work. You know, there are certain cards that allow you to change the amount of damage you do, weaken Venominaga and allowing her to attack directly, although you can't equip those equip spells, so that doesn't work. In any case, Venominaga, a fantastically designed boss monster for an archetype that is a little tricky to actually pull off summoning her on their own. I mean, there's very little on their own that Venoms can do to summon out Venominaga. But it's not unheard of to do so. It just takes a little bit of time and effort, which sadly modern Yu-Gi-Oh just doesn't allow us to enjoy the build-up of summoning out a monster of this caliber anymore. Nowadays, if your boss monster can't be summoning out by sneezing, then you just are playing the wrong deck. That's the modern-day mentality there. So now that we've gone over the monster category, let's go ahead and take a look at some spell traps. First off, we have Venom Shot, a normal spell that states that you can only activate this card while you control a Venom monster, Venominaga, or Venominon. You send a reptile monster from the deck to the graveyard and place 2 Venom counters on a face-up monster the opponent controls. Simple, but effective. Because let's remember, this is an unlimited version of Foolish Burial. Granted, it only works for Venoms, but it works on any reptile monster. Venom Shot, absolutely massive card. I wish it was a quick play spell, but doesn't matter. Venom Shot can allow you to just weaken your opponent's monster by a fat 1,000 as long as Venom Swamp's on the board. More importantly, it's setting up your graveyard with reptile monsters, which we're still waiting for all those reptile floaters and, you know, graveyard effects. I mean, there's what's his face? Yamori Mori. Yamori Mori still works. Yamori Mori still works with this card, so perfectly acceptable sort of thing. And hey, Yamori Mori can pop a monster you control, weaken the opponent's monster, set yourself up for popping Phenomenon, I would call that a win. I'd call that a win card right there. You want to run a couple copies of this thing in a Venom deck. I'd say 2 is plenty, considering the other card we're going to be using to send cards to the graveyard. Now, before we get into this next spell, I want to give everyone a fair bit of warning. If you are traumatized from the sight of your opponent going into massive amounts of graveyard setup, you might want to just be prepared for this next card. That being, of course, one of the most powerful grave setup cards of the game, that being Snake Rain, a normal spell that states that you discard a card to send 4 reptile monsters from the deck to the graveyard. Woo! That's some grass looks greener looking nonsense right there. Discard any card in the hand, send any 4 reptiles from the deck to the grave, and a normal spell with no once per turn restriction, no restriction on the monsters that you send. They can be 3 of the same thing or whatever you want. And all it costs is 1 discard of anything you'd like. It's absolutely nutty. You can take a Phenomenon and give him a back 2,500 boost in 1 move. Take that, Buster Rancher. You don't know anything about big numbers. Nothing at all. But yes, all aside, Snake Rain is an absolutely insane spell. Much in the same vein of things like Grass Looks Greener, Painful Choice to an extent. It's just a card that's allowing you to set up your graveyard massively. And that's ultimately the problem with it. Snake Rain is such an absolutely busted spell card that it's made it difficult to give Venoms anything new to them. You know, if we're going by modern Yu-Gi-Oh standards, new Venom monsters are going to have graveyard effects, floating effects. They're going to be based around Snake Rain. Players expect it. Players demand it. But if you give them too much, then my goodness, you're going to take Venoms and take them from a 67th tier deck and raise them all the way to tier 0 if you got a bunch of snake floaters and graveyard setting up monsters. It's just, it makes things tricky. And for that reason, I believe firmly that Snake Rain is one of the reasons Venoms have never gotten support. Is because Konami has to be so overly careful with what they give Venoms thanks to this spell. Because if the cards aren't good enough, no one's going to play them. But if they're too good, they're going to hit Snake Rain. And that's not just going to hurt Venoms, it's going to hurt all Galactics, because what are all Galactics going to do without this? In your Venom deck, you want to run at least 2 copies of this card. You might think 3, but you're rarely going to be milling 8 reptiles in 1 turn, unless, of course, that new support makes it vital, in which case, run 3 of the gosh darn thing. But as it stands, twice is usually plenty. I mean, 8 different reptiles in the graveyard, that's quite a bit of attack to giving Phenomenon and Phenomenaga. So, honestly, that's probably plenty. Let's enjoy in moderation there. Before we move on to the other Venom cards, I just want to briefly bring up Snake Lily of the Abyss, which is an Ogdoadic spell that ditches a reptile from the deck to the grave. If you have 5 or more reptiles with different names in the grave, you can summon a reptile from your graveyard. It's Foolish Burial meets Monster Born meets, well, it is a once per turn, sadly, but it is a modern card. It's a fantastic card to pair up with Snake Rain, and it allows you to turbo out Phenomenon. So it's a very good card to be playing in your Venom deck. You never want to run it without it. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the Venom Trap cards. We first start off with Ambush Fangs. It's a normal trap that activates only when a Venom monster is declared as an attack target. It negates the attack and ends the battle phase and places a Venom counter on the monster that attacked. That's actually pretty dang good for an early sort of battle trap. Granted, I would have liked to have everybody with a Venom counter, but I'm not complaining. Just if your opponent attacks your Venoms, you know, they're trying to clear out your Venoms before they start spewing out all them Venom counters. You're stopping them in their tracks, ending their battle phase, and putting that counter on your opponent anyway. It's actually pretty dang good. That's a solid effect. It's kind of like hitting your opponent with Threatening Roar, but they get spit in the face with poison. So there you go. And yeah, I can kind of see why Venom Cobra has issues with his aim. This guy is like, what? He's almost as big as Gigo. Okay, that's a pretty big dude. Snake Deity's Command is a counter trap card that activates only by showing your opponent a Venom monster in your hand, and negates the activation and effect of an opponent's spell and destroys it. Again, that's a very good card. You know, all you need to do is have a Venom in the hand. Again, this does not count Phenomenaga and Phenomenon. But it allows you to stop any of your opponent's spells. That's really good. It's a very solid effect. It's kind of weird that it doesn't work on Phenomenaga, considering she's literally right there about to chomp down on this dude. Dude, he is not having a good day whatsoever. But I'm not complaining. The fact is that your opponent's going to be trying to use their spells, whether to summon out monsters, or more likely trying to blow up your swamp. It's a really good counter trap to be putting in your Venom. It costs you almost nothing. You just have to have a Venom in the hand, and then you was good to just stop stopping your opponent's spells. It's not a once per turn. It doesn't cost you anything. It costs your opponent everything. That's how good it is. Okay? You run 3 of this darn thing because it's just that good. Lastly, for Venoms, we take a look at Venom Burn, a normal trap that selects a monster with a Venom counter, removes all Venom counters from that card, inflicts 700 damage to your opponent for every Venom counter removed. Now, this card is a bit of a stinker, to be honest. It seems a little counterintuitive to Venoms that you would give your opponent all these Venom counters onto their monster and then take them away for a little bit of damage. I mean, to be fair, if they have like a 3,000 point beat stick and you've reduced it to 500, that's a decent amount of damage you can turn off a Venom Burn. But are you really going to do that? I don't think so. That's not what you want to do at all. You don't want to take away the counters. You want to put more counters on the opponent. Now, maybe if your opponent had a monster with 0 attack and it couldn't be destroyed by stuff, Arcana Force 0 Jaful was out during this time, so conceivably you could put a bunch of counters on Arcana, but this is such an easily telegraphed move. Your opponent's just going to get rid of a monster. If they see you put 10 counters on a monster, then they're going to get rid of the darn thing. They're not going to leave it on the board. Better it would have been if Venom Burn had been, say, I don't know, a continuous trap, perhaps, that burnt the opponent for, I don't know, maybe less than 700. Maybe like 500 damage if your opponent's monster with Venom counters left the board or something. Something like that would have probably been a little bit better. You know, it would have incentivized your opponent to keep their Venom countered monsters on the board, perhaps. Hard to say. You know, it all depends on how the card was worded and all that. Maybe if your opponent like tributed a monster with Venom counters, then they would take burn damage. I don't know, but I feel like this card's a little bit of a disappointing finish. Now, the only thing I can think of that you'd actually use this card for is if your opponent went to destroy Venom Swamp while they had a monster with a bunch of counters, you want to just burn them, or if they're close to the end of their life points anyway, to finish off a struggling opponent, maybe. But it's really hard to see Venom Burn actually doing you any good. Now, before we finish up, I'm just going to bring out a couple cards that I found while in EDO Pro that just kind of go with the flow of Venoms and what they do and support them in little ways. You have things like Block Mamba, which is a very nice level 3, which can be special summon while you have a Reptile on the board, which also sends Reptiles from the deck to the graveyard and changes monsters' battle positions. Very nice in combination with Venom Snake to set up a rank 3 play. You have things like Yamori Mori, which we already mentioned before, which can set himself to the graveyard thanks to Snake Rain and the like. So it allows you to pop your monsters and reduce your monster's attack to 0. You have things like Lami, which can search out level 8 reptiles from the deck to the hand when it's summoned, and when banished, it can make a monster indestructible by card effects for a turn. You have things like Ragnarika Wicked Butterfly, which can be discarded to summon a reptile from the hand. Sadly, doesn't work on Phenomenon, but that's just fine. You have things like Evil Dragon Ananta, which if you have a whole bunch of reptiles on the grave, you just need a really, really big beat stick. You can just banish all your reptiles to make this thing onto the board. And then, of course, we have things like Therian's Empress Alasia, which just works with reptile monsters. And if you just need a big old honking beat stick, and it's also level 8. Goes nicely with the trade-in strat with the Phenomenon. And lastly, we have cards like Viper's Grudge, which stops non-reptiles from attacking, and you can't use their effects. But if a reptile is destroyed by battle and sent to the grave, you're going to summon a level 4 or lower reptile from the deck. So, keeps your monsters on the board if they happen to get destroyed. So, Venoms. It's so crazy that they have gone so long without a direct support line. Yes, we've had reptile support cards. Yes, we have different cards that work with Venoms. But they have not been directly supported since their inception. And to me, that is absolutely insane. You know, every other GX archetype has been supported in one way or another, but Venoms have not. I don't know if that's because Viper's not a very popular character or something, or Konami's just so scared of Snake Rain becoming so broken that, you know, they just haven't touched him. But then again, can it be Snake Rain alone? Ogdoadics are a thing, yet Snake Rain remains untouched. I don't know what to say. I feel like Venoms definitely deserve some form of support. You know, every other GX archetype has had support. Every other character in that show has had support, whether they were big characters or small characters. So why not Venoms too? You know, there's so much that can be done to them, and there's definitely a lot that they could use. They could use a bit more presence in the main deck, a few more monsters that have swarming capabilities, and more importantly, the ability to make more use out of Venom counters, more counter spreading. This is an archetype that barely consists of a dozen cards, and so, yes, it would take a lot to make Venoms work nowadays, but there's a lot of room to grow. You know, if elemental heroes can have, like, what, hundreds of cards in the archetype, why not give Venoms, like, I don't know, 10? 10 is, I think, fair. I think that would be plenty. Couple main deckers, a couple spell traps, maybe a fusion that makes Venomanaga like a new version of Venomanaga. Same effect, just make her bigger and easier to summon. That's what I want to see. It's just a better way to get Venomanaga out. Some main deckers that just can swarm the board, spread counters a bit better. Some monsters in the graveyard that you'd banish or like you'll get something when they're sent to the grave. Make Snake Rain great again. That's what I want to see. So, while I don't know when we're going to get Venoms, I'm sure that so long as Konami doesn't go bankrupt tomorrow, they're going to get support in one way or another. It's not going to take a rocket scientist, you know? Scrap's got better support just from 3 cards, you know? Volcanic's got their support, and they are amazing. It's not hard to do. We just need to sit down at the table and say, where the Snake's at? Thank you all very much for watching this episode of Card Talks. It's been a while coming, but we finally talked about the Snaky Boys. And the next episode will be coming out in a few months. I do have the 100 Days of Yu-Gi-Oh! To deal with, and that's going to take up most of my time. But I do want to take a look at many more decks, and I would like to take a look at Heroes. Might not be the next episode of Card Talks, but it's definitely going to be on the docket. It's just going to be huge, because I just typed in Hero 1 to EDO Pro, and it says there's 295 of them. That's a lot of cards. Am I gonna have enough jokes? I don't know if I'm gonna have enough jokes for that, but we'll find out.